cotton and grain sorghum and development and management and things. And now we've got some very capable people that have followed me, and I hope they get everything lined up so we can keep growing cotton, even at 60 cents the way it looks. But it's not a good situation for us. What I've been asked to talk about this morning, and then I'll be followed by Bob, who will talk about how we use this information. I want to talk about potential evapotranspiration. This is called PET, and sometimes this evaporation is kind of like a pit bulldog. It can bite you pretty quick, and we've observed that the past 4 years, especially in 2011. I want to spend my time talking about what atmospheric factors determine the daily conversion of liquid water to water vapor, and results in water loss from surface water and from soil and crop systems. Potential ET is the potential evaporating conditions of the atmosphere. And this is what we see for this area. This is a 100-year weather data. We have the red bars represent the potential ET, and the blue bars represent the precipitation. We are considered semi-arid. Red is from Georgia, which is subtropical, definitely humid. 60 inches of rain and probably 30 inches of PET over the summer maybe. Out here, we have 13 to 14 inches of rain during the summer growing season if we get average rainfall. And you see most of the rain is in May and June and a little bit more in September. Those are our summer average rainfall. But that's also the time when we have the greatest potential ET. And so the average rainfall for this area is 18.6 inches. We get about 13 to 14 inches of that in the summer growing season. And if we could get that 13 to 14 inches with some minimum amounts of supplemental irrigation, we could make some pretty dadgum good crops. But we haven't had that 13 to 14 inches except this year, and then we got about 7 or 8 of that in September, which did more harm than did good. So this is the weather conditions that we're working with, and they don't change a whole lot, even though we talk about climate change and temperature increases. We're not getting a whole lot of rainfall or any less. Evaporation of water requires 3 components. One is the energy, and that's provided by solar radiation. In order to evaporate basically a quart of water, we need 2.45 megajoules per quart. And our radiation load, our average daily net radiation, ranges from 20 to 30 megajoules per square meter per day. Now, if you convert that to all of that energy being used to evaporate water, that's about 32 hundredths to 48 hundredths of an acre inch per day of potential evaporation. Okay? And that's potential is water evaporating from a free water surface, like a wet soil surface. If you get a rain and get that radiation load the very next day, you're going to lose up to 3/10 of an inch in soil evaporation. The lake surfaces and things, that's the potential. That's the evaporating power of the atmosphere. I'll talk a little bit later about crop water use. Crop water use rarely is 100% until we get a crop that is completely covering the ground and intercepting all the radiation. The second major component that's responsible for evaporation is what we call the vapor pressure deficit. This is the water holding capacity of the air relative to the amount of water that's in the air. Dew points, if you listen to the weather projector or weather commentators, they talk about the dew point. The dew point is the temperature where water begins to condense. That's why it's called dew. You get when the temperature of a surface reaches that so-called temperature, then the water condenses and you see dew. As the temperature increases, the water holding capacity of the air increases. So as the day progresses from early in the morning, that's usually when the dew point is at its best, is early in the morning. That's when the temperature is very close to the dew point. As the day progresses and the temperature increases, the relative humidity decreases. Relative humidity is simply the water content of the air relative to the water holding capacity of the air. And that's the thing that creates this large variable between the evaporating surface and the air above it. Now we need air to be flowing over this evaporating surface to maintain that water deficit in the air. So if we've got a wet soil and air is moving across it, evaporation continues. If it's a humid area like in the southeast, the water will evaporate, but a lot of it turns right back into liquid. It never really moves out of the system. We don't happen to have that benefit. We have plenty of air and plenty of heat reaching the ground. We've talked about weather station networks, and this is a picture of a weather station, but I'm going to show you some others. In the late 40s, Penman and Monteith developed this equation to use the weather components, net radiation, I'll show you in a minute, but net radiation, temperature, and humidity to calculate potential evapotranspiration. This is a well-accepted equation for calculating potential ET, and it's being used worldwide. We have access to one of the best weather station networks in the entire U.S. at this point in time. This is the West Texas Mesonet. There's about 75 weather stations across the West Texas area now, and these are the locations. This is maintained out at Reese, managed by Wes Burgett, who is unbelievably good in terms of keeping that network operating at its maximum efficiency. This is his baby. I was involved back in the 90s in helping get this established. That was when Reese closed, and when Reese closed, the Department of Defense gave the city of Lubbock $2 million, and they let Tech have $1 million of that to develop something of economic value to the area. And I represented the College of Agriculture. We had civil engineers, we had atmospheric scientists, and we all agreed upon trying to start this kind of weather station network. This is the page where you get the information. This is the daily summary. These weather stations collect data every 5 minutes, but then it's summarized in a daily. And so you have temperatures, and right over here, wherever it's at, is potential ET in both millimeters and inches. And so you have a very comprehensive daily weather system. And Bob's going to talk about how we use this to manage water applications. If we had all of the incoming radiation absorbed by that leaf, we would have one heck of a high water use on a daily basis. The incoming radiation, about 15 to 20% of it is reflected. The position or the amount of leaf area that's out there is intercepting radiation. And so as the plant is small, there's radiation being absorbed by those leaves that are there, but the vast majority of the radiation hits the ground. And if it's a wet soil, it's going to evaporate the water. But about 15 to 20% of the incoming is reflected, about 5% is transmitted through the leaf. Now, radiation, light is necessary for photosynthesis, so we want a significant amount of radiation to be absorbed by the leaf so that the plant can photosynthesize. Re-radiation is the amount of heat that is being produced by that light, by that radiation that's being absorbed. And that's infrared. We can measure that. The big one here is, oops, got the wrong button there, is the evaporation. And that's the amount of energy that is being used out of that radiation that's being absorbed to produce vapor and evaporate water. I've taken the 10-year average, the last 10 years, and plotted the monthly average daily radiation and the average daily potential ET. And as you can see, they're very parallel. The months of May and June are the highest radiation loads because June the 21st is we've got equal amounts of, or the longest days on June the 21st. And when the sun is directly overhead, that radiation is coming straight down. Early in the morning and late in the afternoon, the radiation is at an angle. But when we have about 6 hours during the middle of the day where it's direct radiation, we have a tremendous amount of energy that the plant is trying to absorb. The relative humidity is related to the air temperature. And as I mentioned, as the air temperature increases, the water holding capacity increases, and therefore the relative humidity declines. I've taken a lot of data here from, what does that start at, about 58 degrees. At 58 degrees, this again is in 2011. We start out early in April at 58 degrees for the maximum daily temperature, and we progress out to about 108 degrees in 2011. And anytime we get past about 85 degrees, the relative humidity is very low. And 2011, it was very low and a lot of potential ET. This is the 2011 versus 2014 daily minimum relative humidity. And again, the red boxes are the 2011, but the blue boxes are 2014. We had significant rain, we had less temperatures, we had higher relative humidities, and potential evaporation was considerably less until we got into August. But that's the difference between the humidities that set the stage for evaporation of water. This is the daily PET versus minimum daily relative humidity for 2011. The red line is the daily PET, and the blue line is the relative humidity. Most of that humidity was less than 20% per day. A lot of it 10%. That's pretty dadgum dry. And the PET at that time was running about 0.3 to 0.4 inch per day. The potential ET. Again, keep in mind, this is the potential evaporating power. If you were sprinkle irrigating, or you got a rain, that's what the evaporation rate would be. Depending upon the crop. If we didn't have any large crop growing out there in those times, the crop water use was significantly less than that. But the potential evaporation was very high. And 2011 was a killer. This is the daily PET for Lubbock, Lamesa, and Plainview for 2011. And the reason I put this up there is, again, just to show that in June and July, or May and June and July, we had very high rates. The difference is, well, not the difference, but this is there to show you that day to day, the variability is quite significant. But location to location, it's fairly consistent. It's not like our rainfall. A county road can separate a 1/2 inch from dirt. But evaporation, or the factors that control evaporation of water, are fairly consistent across a very large area. And so those three locations represent about over 100-mile distance from north to south. And there's not a whole lot of variability there. It's a lot of day-to-day, but not variability due to location. In 2011, if you accumulate that, Lubbock had 53 inches of accumulated radiation from the 1st of April through the end of September. Our potential evaporation was 51 inches or 53 inches of water. Plainview was 56. I can't read those here. Lamesa was 56 and Plainview was 56. That's over the growing season. That was the potential. Okay? In 2014, with the higher humidity, this again, the red lines are the daily PET, the blue lines are the relative humidity. We had some spikes in there for low humidities that increased PET. But when you look at the variability again, it's a lot of day-to-day variability in both PET and humidity, relative humidity. But we had a much lower evaporation rate in 2014 than we did in 2011. This is again the 2014 daily PET for Lubbock, Plainview, and Lamesa. And again, we've got the day-to-day. May was one of our drier periods, as we all remember. It was pretty tough getting started in May. But then June, we got all the rain. And so we had much lower evaporation rates in June than we had. And again, in September, they were relatively low. The three locations, again, are very similar in the day and the long-term, or not the long-term, but the seasonal potential ET. So my point is that we have a lot of day-to-day variability, but not a lot of locational variability. We used about 15 less inches of water in 2014 than we did, not use that much, but the potential evaporation was about 15 inches less in 2014 than in 2011. You couldn't put enough water on in 2011 to keep the crop from suffering some stress. So 2014 was a little better. Again, the accumulated PET for 2014. Again, not a whole lot of variability from location to location. Now, crop water use is a little bit different story, because what we've been talking about to this point are the factors that affect the potential. Crop water use is based upon potential ET, that's the potential, but then on the amount or the factors that are both biological and agronomic. Leaf area index is the area of leaves per unit area of ground. And when a crop starts out early, it has a very small leaf area index. Most of the surface is bare ground. Once it begins to grow, the leaves expand, the height increases, we get a much greater amount of incoming radiation absorbed by the plants. And that's when we start really building up crop water use. Plants have pores on the leaves that are called stomates. And those stomates are controlled, first of all, by light. The stomates have to have light to open, so they're closed at night. And the leaves usually have a waxy surface or a cutin on the surface that minimizes or actually eliminates water from just leaving the leaf unless it goes through the stomate. So transpiration, which is water that is evaporating from the plant itself, is a daytime factor. And so as the temperature increases and the humidity decreases and it's absorbing radiation, the crop water use increases as the leaf area index increases. stomatal conductance is there, and canopy architecture. We have corn hybrids, and have had for a while, that have not just plainer leaves, but more erect leaves. And you get much greater light reflectance off of a erect leaf type than you do a planer. You've got planer leaves out there, they're absorbing everything that's come down. More erect leaf types reflect the energy and don't let as much be absorbed that will convert to heat that will evaporate water. And that's a very important trait. Back in the 80s, I spent some time when Delbert Hess was a plant breeder up at Cargill, working on paymaster cottons with ocreleaf cotton. I think Craig's doing something with ocreleaf again. But the breeders didn't like ocreleaf cotton because it shed too many squares. But from a water use standpoint, it greatly reduced the daily water use. And yields were just about as good with the ocreleaf as with a big old normal planer leaf. You find them the same thing? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you know, we had back there when we had FiberMax 800, it was an ocreleaf type. And it did a pretty darn good job out here. We might need to be talking a little more about that. Maybe Craig's going to talk about it today. Okay? But canopy architecture, leaf orientation. From an agronomic standpoint, from what we do with the crop, row spacing, in my opinion, is very important because we can go to narrow rows and reduce the amount of bare soil surface and increase. Now, the crop water use will increase in that system because you got more plants per acre in narrow rows. But you're going to use the water going through the plant rather than lose the water to bare soil evaporation. The water that goes through the plant is water that makes you yield in money. The water that's on the soil surface is what's evaporating. That's a total waste. And so if we get rain, or if you're using sprinkler irrigation, and you've got wide roads, or especially early in the season, and you're wasting a bunch of that water, well, that's not a good situation. Row orientation is another thing. We did a lot of work back in the 80s and stuff on row orientation, especially under dryland conditions. And what we found was that north-south rows reduce wind movement through the crop, they increase crop canopy light interception, and then on pivots, circular rows give you the best system to manage both wind movement and the light intensity hitting the ground. Okay. North-south rows, our winds are predominantly from the southwest, and you don't get the wind blowing through the between the rows, which increases the evaporation. The wind goes over the rows, and so that's a little better. And from a light standpoint, if you got east-west rows, the sun comes up in the east and sets in the west, and you got direct, or you got sunshine on that bare soil all day long. Where if you got north-south, the sun is being shaded, or the plants are shading the sun and shading the bare ground for about 3 hours in the morning and about 3 hours in the afternoon, which reduces the energy load on the bare soil. So row orientation and row spacing are things that we can manage and have an influence on using our water supply more efficiently. Soil surface residue, crop residue management increases infiltration, reduces soil evaporation. I think Kelly talked about residue management from an organic standpoint or organic matter standpoint. If you have a crop like corn or sorghum or wheat that has a light-colored stalk or residue, that reflects radiation. Kelly mentioned about it cooling the soil or keeping the soil cool. But it has a great impact on water also. When we get the rains in the summer, the kinetic energy of that raindrop is enough to cause a splash, and when that happens, you have slower infiltration rates. when that raindrops hits a piece of residue, it doesn't hit the bare soil. And so the water has lost its energy when it gets to the soil, and it has a much greater chance of going in and not running off. The other thing is, when you have that residue on the surface and you've got a row planted and the residue's in the middle, the radiation that hits that is reflected rather than absorbed, a very high percentage of it. So you're not getting the energy to evaporate water. If you've got soil, if you've got 40-inch rows and you've got a darker colored soil out there, that soil gets hotter than blue blazes with direct radiation. That lowers the humidity between the rows, and now you're just sucking it out rather than keeping it more at the air temperature. In 2011, when that little cotton was trying to come up, the cotyledons were burning off at the surface of the ground. I got an infrared thermometer and measured that, and I was measuring 125-degree temperature at the soil surface. Now what that was doing, that will denature protein. That's a hot enough temperature to denature protein, and all of that little cotyledon, the proteins were just being coagulated, and the leaves died, the cotyledons died. So management of your residue and the type of residue is very important. So those are some of the things that we can do to manage crop water use, or to reduce the waste of water. And again, the point is, what goes through the crop is money in the bank. What's wasted is money lost. These are the stomates. This on the left-hand side is kind of what grasses have: corn, sorghum, wheat. They have elongated stomates. They're uniformly distributed on both surfaces of the leaves. This lower one down here is kind of what cotton stomates look like. Cotton has more stomates on the upper surface, the bottom surface, than they do on the upper surface. And that's pretty darn good, because we're losing, the stomates are responsible for taking in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, but every time that hole opens, water vapor is going to come out, because the inside of the leaf is very high in water. And so if you've got an open hole, not only is carbon dioxide going in for photosynthesis, but water vapor is coming out. And so we can't have growth by photosynthesis without the plant losing water. Transpiration is the process that's taking place here. We call it the water loss by plants. Evaporation is a big function of that transpiration process. But transpiration is essential for the plant to bring water from the root system, from the soil through the root system, bringing minerals up into the rest of the plant, and moving organic material around the plant. So transpiration is an essential process. It costs water. And there's not much we can do about that either, but there are things we can do about water management to reduce waste. This is a picture of 40-inch rows, and the reason I show this, these plants are about the same stage. Now look at the amount of bare space between those rows at that point in time. This is what 30-inch rows look like. You got 25% less bare space. You've got a few more plants per acre probably, but the water that's going through the 30-inch rows, you're going to use a little more water in the crop, but you're not wasting water that's in those bare rows, bare space between the rows on 40-inch rows. Now, let's talk about crop water use, and Bob's going to spend a lot more time on it. We have a term called crop coefficients. A crop coefficient is the crop water use, the actual water use of the crop, divided by the potential ET. So what we've been talking about up to this point is the potential, what the atmosphere will cause in terms of evaporation of water from a free water surface. Now when we're talking about a crop, the crop is not going to use 100% of potential until it's got a complete canopy covering the ground and all of the radiation is being absorbed by that crop. So the crop coefficient is crop specific. It varies with stage of development and amount of ground cover and soil water availability. And so that's what crop coefficients are. And Bob's going to spend time on this in terms of talking about water application rates. This is the corn and sorghum crop water use and the crop coefficients. On this side is the crop water use as a function of potential ET. It ranges from essentially 0 to 100%. And this is days after planting. And I've got corn and sorghum on here. And I've identified some of the critical growth stages, like the initiation of reproductive structures, the flowering, and the grain maturity. And when we start out early, there's not much plant material out there, not very much leaf area, until we get a plant up to about 35, 40 days of age. And that's when it's beginning to initiate the reproductive structures, and that period from there to flowering is the most critical time in the life of that plant for producing yield potential. Okay? Once we get the canopy completely covering the ground, then we're using basically 100% of the potential ET. That crop will use whatever the atmosphere demands that day. And so then once we reach grain maturity, leaves begin to senesce and the crop begins to use less water. One of the advantages of grain sorghum over corn is when you plant. We typically will plant corn in mid-April or late April and early May. And again, if you remember those potential ETs, late May and June are our highest potential ETs. And so that corn crop, when it hits this point right here of initiating reproductive structure, we're having pretty high potential ETs at that time. Sorghum, at least for West Texas, in my opinion, the ideal planting date for sorghum is not till about the 10th of June. So you're kind of missing all of that heat and radiation in late May and early June. And that crop then will be 30 days later than the corn crop. And so it goes through that critical time when we're having less potential ET. But the critical points on both of these is when you initiate the reproductive structure, and I think we'll hear more about that this afternoon. This is the crop coefficients for cotton that we think are correct. And again, this is the crop water use as a percentage of potential ET, and the heat units. Cotton development is based upon heat units. All crop development is based on heat units. Growth is not based on heat units. Growth is a function of water supply and fertilizer and the type of crop and that type of thing. But the water use, or the development of the plant, the specific stages of development, like first square, first flower, peak bloom, and so on, are based upon heat units. What we see here is that this is the crop coefficient on the left-hand side and the accumulated heat units. At first square, the crop coefficient is about 20%. So if we have 2/10 inch of water in PET, 2/10 of water use by PET, then that's only going to be 4/100 of an inch a day. Early in the life of that plant, early in the life of all plants, the vast majority of water loss is due to bare soil evaporation rather than crop water use. It's only when they get a leaf area index up here, like at first flower, we're using about 62, 63%. We still don't have that canopy closed, unless we're broadcast cotton. But if we're in 30-inch rows, it's probably 60, 65%. If we're 40-inch rows, it's probably less than that. At peak flower, we typically have the ground completely covered with leaves, have a full canopy closed, and at that point, it's approaching 100% of potential. The evaporation rate or the crop water use is essentially. But now we're at peak flower, we're out there in August. maximum was in May and June and into July. But by the time we got into the middle part of July and into August, the PET was dropping off. So instead of 35 hundredths of an inch in June, it's 25 hundredths of an inch in August. Except this year was pretty dead hot. 2011 was hot. So those are the crop coefficients. And again, Bob's going to spend time talking about how to use these for irrigation. One of the things that you need to know is how much water do you have. And this is a table that has been around for a long, long time. Gallons per minute per acre. If you got a 125 acre pivot and you got 500 gallons a minute water on that, you got 4 gallons per minute per acre. That will allow you to provide a little over 2/10 of an inch a day. And I think Kelly mentioned, or maybe Red mentioned, about irrigation. Don't apply little volumes. Apply at least a 3/4 inch. Red did, yes. And apply at least 3/4 inch to an inch per application. And you're going to be a lot better off. But we think for cotton, if we get average rainfall, we're getting 1/10 of an inch per day in rainfall. And if you can provide somewhere between 1.6 and 2.1 inches per day, 3 to 4 gallons per minute per acre, you can keep that crop happy, that cotton crop. Probably not keep corn crop happy with that, but you can keep the cotton crop happy with that. So this is something that you need to know. How much water do you have? What is that crop going to demand? Somewhere, we set up a lot of drip systems early with 2 gallons per minute per acre. And that's just not enough water. That's 1/10 of an inch of water a day applied through the drip system. And if we get another 1/10 of an inch of rain, we've only got 2/10 of an inch of water a day. And if we've got a good crop started and we get into July, late July and August, and we're running 25 hundredths to 3/10 of an inch of PET a day, of crop water use a day, we're going to run into stress. So I think it's been mentioned a time or two that with this limited water supply now, we have to provide the water that that crop needs. You may have to reduce acreage. I mean, there's a lot of pivots now that are half surface. Half is irrigated cotton, the other half is dryland grain sorghum or something like that. Because we've got to keep that crop happy. And it will pay dividends for us. If we let it stress, cotton is no different than corn or sorghum. When it begins to initiate reproductive development, square initiation through flowering, when you see a cotton plant beginning to flower, every square that you're going to harvest is already on that plant. And if you have water stress from that 6-leaf stage to first flower, you've limited the number of square sites that the plant's going to have. And then you run into a situation like we did this year with all that rain late, which was too late, and the plant never quit growing. And we got a bale of the acre of bolls at the top that just wasted. And so, but if you let that plant stress from first square through, actually if you let it stress from first square to first flower, you limit your yield potential. If you let it stress all the way through flowering, through the 3rd week of flowering, you're having boll abortion. And so you got to keep it happy from first square until you get about middle August, when probably the last flower that has a chance to mature is already set and is not going to be lost. Boll abortion, if that little boll can live for 5 days, it's probably going to stay on. But if it gets stressed from the time it's a flower until it's 5 days old, it's going to abort. And a lot of that is water stress and nutrient stress. All right, just to sum this up, imagine I've run out of time. Have I talked too much? All right, atmospheric conditions determine the rate of water evaporation on a daily and seasonal basis. Crops types, stage of growth, agronomic practices are determine crop water use. So that's all I have to say, and Bob's gonna finish this up with using this information.
All right, thanks, Dr. Craig.